island I found this archipelago?
Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, how to train your dragon. But before we can talk about how to train your dragon, we have to talk about DreamWorks. Jeffrey Katzenberg, the chairman of Disney during the 80s and 90s, and one of the figures most responsible for the Disney Renaissance, was forced out of the company under complicated and nebulous circumstances. Katzenberg already had a career lesser execs could only dream of, and when he sued Disney, they settled out of court with him for $250 million, but he still wanted revenge, and he wanted to keep making movies, so he formed a new company with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen. This was DreamWorks, and its rise and fall is complicated enough that talking about all of it would leave me with no time for talking about How to Train Your Dragon, so I'm going to focus on DreamWorks' animation division. DreamWorks had a reputation for making animated films that were more daring and dark than Disney dared. These included Ants and The Prince of Egypt. Then in 2001, they released Shrek. This was both the best and the worst moment for the company. Shrek was a massive hit, becoming the fourth highest grossing film of 2001, and grossing more than twice as much as any DreamWorks film had grossed before. This signaled the direction the company would take. It would steer away from darker, more challenging animation, and toward the formula that made Shrek a success, meaning a jocular, parodic tone, complete with puerile humor, major characters voiced by popular celebrity comedians, a heaping of adult jokes, put adult in quotes, that fly over the heads of kids, and references that have precious little to do with the main plot. When Shrek 2 became the highest grossing film of 2004, grossing even more than the best Spider-Man movie and the best Harry Potter movie, DreamWorks' fate was sealed. There's a poetic tragedy to DreamWorks' decline. The same ideas that shot it to stardom also caused it to lose its newfound throne as the king of American animation to Pixar and a resurgent Disney. The worst of the films it made to directly capitalize on Shrek's success was also the first, that being Shark Tale, a film which is thankfully only remembered when it is mocked, but there was also Over the Hedge, Flushed Away, the annoyingly successful Madagascar films, and Shreks 3 and 4. DreamWorks became stale. It didn't understand why the first two Shreks worked. They weren't big critical and commercial successes because of their formula, but because they executed that formula with wit and ambition. DreamWorks had lost its magic. But then two films were released that may not have turned around the company's fortunes, but nonetheless proved that DreamWorks Animation could produce poignant and powerful works. The first of these was 2008's Kung Fu Panda, which combined the wit and charm of the first two Shreks with surprisingly heartfelt storytelling. The second, and even more impressive film, was 2010's How to Train Your Dragon. At first I expected this to be another DreamWorks film, nothing more. The concept is simple. A young teenager is an outcast because he likes dragons in a village that hates them, and over the course of the film he convinces them that Vikings should live with dragons. The jokes are vapid and add little. The characters are introduced as little more than one-dimensional ideas. The disapproving, jock-like father, the ice queen whose heart needs to be melted by the awkward nerd, and so on. But when I actually watched it, I was in awe. The common thread linking this film to Kung Fu Panda, aside from the surprising quality, is the lovely animation. Kung Fu Panda has gorgeous eastern vistas and poignant sunsets. How to Train Your Dragon has flying scenes that embarrass the acclaimed flying scenes in James Cameron's Avatar. They are as exhilarating to watch as they are to the characters, but the film is also capable of conveying more than sheer excitement with them. My favorite scene in the film comes when our protagonist, Hiccup, takes the girl he's infatuated with, Astrid, on a ride on his dragon. Romantic strings swell, and they fly above the golden clouds. On a basic plot level, this is a simple scene where a nerdy guy proves to the girl he's trying to woo that he is in fact cool. but the execution is masterful. It sets flying as a realm apart and elevated from the standard world of the film. It makes the case that flying is more than pulse-pounding. It's magical, allowing entrance into a world far removed from the drain and restrictions of everyday life. As the film's major contention is that living with the other, in this case dragons, can be beneficial, that this enchanting flying scene is made possible by a dragon is significant. Most importantly, however, the scene succeeds at being extraordinarily romantic. Hiccup manages to convince Astrid that dragons are not merely savage beasts, forming a bond between the two of them. She's the first person to agree with Hiccup that dragons have value. For her, this matters because he's opened her eyes. For him, this matters because he finally has someone who believes in him. This is the case of a standard concept being elevated by masterful craftsmanship. And in fact, the entire film is a case of that. Perhaps the quintessential case of it. The beats themselves are nothing special, but the earnest sincerity and electric excitement devoted to them makes them soar. The characters may be initially presented as stereotypes, but they're revealed to be more than that. There are no especially clever narrative conceits here. There are no thunderous subversions. Rather, this expansion is done with basic empathy, particularly in regards to Hiccup's father, Stoic the Vast. The film recognizes that for Stoic's transformation from a dragon hater who's ashamed of his son to someone who's more open to dragons and more accepting of his son to be believable and organic, he can't only be evil. He has to be a complete person, not merely an antagonist. This is a broken and scared man who wants what's best for his people. Whatever his flaws, he tries his best to be brave and wise. Though Stoic realizes how wrong he was about Hiccup throughout the course of the narrative, Hiccup comes to a revelation of his own about his father. He realizes that Stoic is not a terrible tyrant, but a misguided person who deserves pity and sympathy and has the capacity to change. All of this makes How to Train Your Dragon, and its even better sequel, which is one of my favorite movies of 2014, enrapturing adventure fiction. The key to writing great adventures is not packing the movie with all the sweeping vistas and otherworldly environments that can be created on a big budget. No, the key is showcasing how that environment shapes and changes the characters and their perspectives. When one takes a vacation, the hope is not merely that they get to see gorgeous sights, but that seeing those sights will change them for the better. One wants to be lifted out of their quotidian life, not only so they can admire the true breadth of the world and the depth of sentiment it can evoke, but also so they can bottle some of those sensations and keep them even after they've returned from their trip. My favorite trips, like my trip to Paris in 2016 and my trip to London in 2017, are not my favorite because of what I saw, but because of how what I saw affected me. However, far too often, the effects of adventures disappear when the adventure is over. The driving vision of adventure fiction is to transcend to this. The driving vision of adventure fiction is the idea of an adventure completely changing us for the better. There are works like The Darjeeling Limited and Lost in Translation and the Before trilogy that are less about how a place transforms people directly and more about how a place brings people into contact with those who will change them for the better. But in the purest adventure fiction, it is the adventure itself that facilitates the transformation. Think about The Legend of Zelda. Over the course of Link's adventures, he becomes someone who can strike down evil. And like Link in Ocarina, his mental and spiritual maturation is accompanied by physical maturation. Between the first and second How to Train Your Dragon films, Hiccup ages 5 years. He becomes an adult. Because of this, different stories are available to him. The second film focuses on him becoming a leader, an arc that becomes essential when he has to succeed Stoic. Who he is at the start of the second movie is satisfying because it's an extension of his growth in the first film. The impact of his adventures in that first film continues to weigh on him here. He's more mature than he is at the end of the first film, but a straight line can be easily drawn between the person he grows into over the course of the first movie and who he is at the start of the second. Nevertheless, the second film is not chained by its connection to the first. It charts its own course, and Hiccup once more grows in response to his adventures. Not all of the second film's ideas are successful, I will admit that. The villain in particular falls flat, and I maintain that any conflict created by mind control is cheap and forgettable, but it's a more ambitious film than the first because it builds on the foundation of that first film. This series is not merely about one adventure changing a protagonist. It's a protagonist being repeatedly changed by a series of adventures that swallow him up in them because he's curious and creative and eager to prove himself. That's a powerful idea, and it's created in Hiccup one of the best characters in the history of animated film.
Become the strongest of them all. And he was right. You have the heart of a chief and the soul of a dragon.
There are, of course, darker approaches to take to adventure fiction. Having a character change during the adventure before reverting back to the person they were before, just like many of us unfortunately tend to do after our trips are over, could be empty cynicism if done wrong, but if done right, it can be gloriously excoriating. Think of that season 3 episode of Mad Men when Dawn and Betty go to Italy, and for the duration of their trip, they remember why they fell in love with each other all those years ago. Then they return home, and everything mutates back to how it was, and all Betty has to remember those memories in Rome is a trinket. Or think of Carmela in season 6 of The Sopranos, who takes a trip to Paris, and is finally able to remove herself from the toxicity of mob life. But when she returns, she slips back into her old routine. Then there's an even darker approach, which involves a person changing, but for the worse. This does not necessarily entail them becoming a worse person, but it does entail them becoming irrevocably broken. Think of Heart of Darkness, or even The Lord of the Rings. Frodo may have defeated Sauron, but the toll carrying the ring took on him could not be undone. One of the most heartbreaking quotes in the whole Lord of the Rings explains this. At the end, Frodo says, "We set out to save the Shire, Sam, and it has been saved, but not for me." We need stories like this to remind us that not every adventure leads to us becoming better, and that that's not our fault. But this does not mean there's anything wrong with stories that speak to the potential of adventures to change us for the better, particularly when they're as masterfully told as the films in the How to Train Your Dragon series. We need adventures. We're lost without them. They do not solve everything, but they can have meaning. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more adventurous content. Also, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, all that transformative stuff. Adios, comrades!